Elara was the forgotten daughter of a fallen pack, a healer with no wolf and no place in a kingdom ruled by strength. But when fate dragged her into the Alpha King's world of trials, betrayal, and shadows, she discovered a truth buried deep within her grief, that her silence held a power older than kings, fiercer than warriors, and capable of healing not just wounds, but the very soul of a broken throne. To save herself and the kingdom teetering on the edge of ruin, Elara must embrace the wolf within and rise as the soul weaver destined to change everything. The music of celebration still thundered through the great hall, echoing with drums and the deep, wild chant of wolves honoring their king. But Elara pressed herself into the shadows, unnoticed, unseen, the weight of her cloak heavy across her trembling shoulders, as if it bore not only the fabric, but the ashes of her ruined past. She had slipped away from the crowded ritual, from the glittering laughter and flashing eyes of wolves adorned for mating alliances, desperate for breath, desperate to escape the suffocating reminder that she belonged to no one, that her pack lay buried in smoke and silence, and her wolf within remained mute, broken, grieving beyond repair. Her footsteps carried her, almost without thought, down the corridor toward the throne room, a chamber that seemed deserted in the fever of the night's festivities, and she pushed through its towering doors as though led by invisible hands, the cavernous silence inside a stark relief from the noise she had fled. Moonlight spilled through the high-stained windows, painting cold silver across the empty dais where the Alpha King's throne loomed, carved from black stone that seemed to breathe with power, and her heart faltered at the sight, awe colliding with a reckless yearning for quiet. She wanted only to rest, to close her eyes, and forget the cruel music of a world that had moved on without her. Before she knew it, her body had sunk into the throne, her hands brushing the armrests polished by centuries of rulers, her head tilting back against its high back, and a shiver rippled through her, as though the seat itself remembered every war, every coronation, every drop of blood shed for dominance. She told herself it was only for a moment, just long enough to gather the fragments of her courage, but as she sat there, the ache of memory welled inside. Her mother's scream, the fire consuming the healer's tent, the endless silence when her wolf did not answer, and tears stung her eyes, unseen in the vastness of the chamber. That was how Kaelin found her. The doors slammed open, a force like a storm entering, and she jolted upright, her breath caught as golden fire burned in the Alpha King's eyes. He was taller than she had imagined, shoulders broad beneath a cloak that shimmered with threads of midnight, his presence crackling like the air before lightning. Fury rolled from him in waves, thick and suffocating, and for a heartbeat she thought her end had come, for what fool dared sit upon the throne of the living Alpha King? But instead of tearing her down, instead of striking her for the insult, Kaelin paused at the foot of the dais, gaze narrowing, the hard line of his jaw tightening as though he saw something he could not name. The silence grew heavier, pressing down until she wished she could sink into the stone and vanish, but she forced herself not to move, not to beg, not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break again. A ripple stirred in the air as others entered behind him, courtiers, guards, curious wolves drawn by the king's wrath, and gasps filled the hall, the sound like the rustle of dry leaves before a fire, their whispers sharp and venomous. She dares. Who is she? Has she lost her mind? Her name had no weight here. She was no one, only a broken healer from a fallen pack. But in that moment, their stares cut deeper than claws. Kaelin's voice finally broke the silence, low and resonant, laced with an anger that seemed to quake the very stones. "Do you know where you sit?" Alara's lips parted, but no sound came, her voice locked in her throat like her wolf had been locked inside her for years, and she could only lower her gaze, ashamed and defiant, all at once. The court leaned forward, hungry for the strike, for punishment, for blood. But Kaelin did not move to tear her down. Instead, he stepped closer, every movement precise, his golden eyes studying her face as if she carried some puzzle only he could see. And then, with a voice that rang through the vaulted chamber and stilled every whisper, he declared, "This woman will serve as my personal healer." A stunned silence crashed through the room, disbelief choking the air, and Elara's heart lurched so violently she thought it might break her ribs. She had expected exile, chains, perhaps even death, but not this. Around her, voices rose in outrage, the courtiers protesting, Lilitha's silken tones cutting above the rest in mocking disbelief. "A healer with no wolf, my king? A stray from a slaughtered pack?" But Kalen silenced them with a single raised hand, his expression unreadable, though something burned in his gaze that made Elara shiver more than his anger had. Recognition, or perhaps dangerous curiosity. The guards looked between themselves, uncertain, and even Rhys, the king's younger brother, frowned as though his sharp mind spun with calculations he did not yet dare voice. From the back of the chamber, Seraphina's eyes caught Elara's, her mentor's expression torn between shock and fierce protective warning, and Elara's breath trembled, wondering if she had just stepped from one prison into another. The murmurs gathered like a storm, the words slipping from lip to lip until it hung in the air with a chilling weight. Soul Weaver. Elara froze, her chest tight, because she knew that name belonged to a legend, not to her, not to the broken girl who had lost everything. But the court believed they saw a ghost return, and the Alpha King stood unwavering, his choice already sealed. In that moment, beneath the unyielding gaze of Kalen and the countless eyes of the court, Elara understood that her quiet life in the shadows had ended forever, and whatever path awaited her now, it began on the throne of shadows where she should never have sat, faded when the world around Elara shifted into something sharper, glittering, and treacherous. For by morning she was no lull, anger invisible. The king's word had pulled her from the shadows and thrust her into a court where every glance was a blade, every smile a mask stretched thin over scorn. Silk-draped nobles with jewels at their throats watched her as though she carried disease, their whispers curling like smoke around her steps as she followed the guards through endless marble corridors, her rough healer's cloak a stark contrast against gowns spun from moonlight and threads of gold. The palace itself was a labyrinth of gleaming halls, mirrors, and chandeliers reflecting an opulence meant to remind her of how little she belonged. And in its heart were faces carved with suspicion, the most venomous of them belonging to Lilitha. The envoy's beauty was sharp, her every word dipped in honey that soured as soon as it touched the ear, and before the assembled courtiers she tilted her head with mock sweetness, her voice carrying far enough for all to hear as she purred. "So this is the king's new treasure? A healer without a wolf, a stray plucked from ash and dressed in borrowed dignity." Laughter rippled, brittle and cruel, but Elara held her breath and said nothing, for Seraphina's hand tightened on her arm, the older healer's eyes cutting like flint as she hissed under her breath. "Do not answer her, not here, not ever, and guard yourself, Elara. Your blood is your greatest danger. If they suspect what you are, they will devour you before Kalen can decide your fate." The warning rooted deep in her chest, an anchor of fear that tangled with the heavy thrum of shame, yet beneath it flickered a faint spark of defiance, too small to glow but refusing to die. In those first days, she clung to Seraphina's steady presence, the one thread of familiarity in a world where every wall seemed to lean in, listening, judging, plotting. Rhys appeared too, the king's younger brother moving with a quiet confidence that drew less attention than Kalen's storm, but carried its own gravity. He did not mock her, nor did he shield her, but when he passed her in corridors or paused to speak, his tone was softer. Than the others, as though he saw more than a broken healer, as though he understood the danger of his brother's gamble, and sought to keep her from shattering beneath it. Yet for every kindness he offered, the court sharpened its teeth, watching, waiting for the moment Elara would stumble. At night, when the palace slept and only the wind whispered through the stone arches, she sat alone in the chamber she had been given, clutching the single possession that still linked her to the family she had lost, the leather-bound journal of her grandmother, Isolde. Its pages were filled with strange symbols, lines that curled and wove like threads of moonlight, words she could not yet decipher but felt thrumming with something alive, something waiting. She traced them with trembling fingers, the memory of Seraphina's warning pressing against her chest. But her heart insisted that within those encrypted pages lay an answer, a promise that her wolf was not gone but buried, silent, aching for release. Yet even with that fragile hope, the palace never let her forget her place. Kalen himself was a storm she could not predict. One moment his voice cut through the court like a blade, commanding and fierce, his golden eyes sparking with the kind of fire that could bend entire packs to their knees. And the next he withdrew into a cold, unreachable silence that chilled even his allies. When he summoned her, she never knew which version she would face. The passionate leader who demanded she walk beside him with her chin high, or the distant king who looked through her as though she were a shadow cast on stone. His volatility kept the court trembling, but for Elara, it was a reminder of the razor's edge she walked, the dangerous gamble he had staked her life upon. Still, as the nights lengthened and the pages of her grandmother's journal whispered beneath her fingertips, a thought began to stir within her like the faintest hum of a song she almost remembered, that perhaps she was not as empty as they believed, that silence was not the same as loss, and that even in the heart of a hostile court, her story was only beginning to take shape. The hush of the palace had barely settled after another night of restless whispers when the calm was shattered by the thunder of heavy doors slamming open, Boren storming into the great court like a tempest wrapped in furs and iron, his presence dragging the chill of the northern winds into the chamber, his voice booming and raw with authority, cut across the hall before the courtiers could draw their breath, demanding that Kalen end what he spat as weakness, this talk of progress and healing, this dangerous defiance of tradition, and instead bind himself to strength by taking a Luna from the bloodlines of power, a mate who would unite the packs beneath him by fear and lineage rather than fragile hope. Gasps circled the chamber, courtiers leaning forward as though the words themselves carried fire, and all eyes turned to Kalen, seated high on his black throne, golden eyes narrowed, jaw tight, the storm within him vibrating against the very walls. He rose slowly, the measured grace of his movement only sharpening the anticipation, and when his reply came, it was steel wrapped in thunder, his refusal a blade that sliced through Boren's demand. He would not shackle himself to the chains of the old world. He would not betray his vision for a kingdom that could rise beyond the brutal past. But as he spoke, his temper surged, his power spilling uncontrolled into the air. His aura shook the stones, chandeliers quivered, and several wolves flinched as the weight of his dominance pressed hard enough to steal breath, the dangerous instability in his control a truth no one could ignore. Boran, far from cowed, seized on it like a predator scenting blood, his voice a challenge that rolled like thunder. If Kalen refused the binding strength of a Luna, let him prove his worth in the ancient trial, the sacred contest of old, where leaders risked blood and spirit to claim their right to rule. The declaration fell like a blade into the hall, heavy with history, and the court erupted in a swell of voices, fear, awe, hunger, all tangled into one. For a heartbeat, Kalen stood in silence, golden eyes burning, and then with a calm that belied the fury trembling in his frame, he accepted. Yet the greater shock came in the breath after, when his gaze slid across the hall and landed on Elara, her presence small yet unyielding beneath the eyes of predators, and his words carved into the air with absolute finality as he named her part of his trial delegation. The chamber broke into chaos, disbelief crashing like waves against stone, courtiers shouting, Lilitha's laugh sharp as glass, voices spitting accusations of madness. How could he tether the fate of a kingdom to a healer without a wolf? To a girl from a fallen pack who had no claws, no power? But Kalen did not waver, his stare pinning the hall into silence once more, and though Elara's chest constricted under the weight of every gaze, she did not falter, even as her mind reeled at the enormity of what had just been set in motion. The uproar of the court still rang in her ears when dawn bled across the horizon, and with it came the king's decree that sealed her fate. For when the names of the trials chosen were spoken aloud, Elara's breath caught as hers was bound to Rorik, Boran's brutal champion, whose reputation carried whispers of broken bones and shattered wills. He loomed like a shadow carved from iron, his eyes cold as the northern ice, his every glance a sneer at the frailty he saw in her frame. And when Kaelin ordered the company assembled, king, brother, healer, and enemy, they set out toward the sunken canyons beneath a sky that seemed to tremble with the weight of what awaited. The path was jagged and treacherous, dust rising beneath their boot. Tees as ancient stones bore the scars of battles long forgotten, and from the very first step, Rorik's contempt was a constant lash, his voice sharp as he mocked the silence she wrapped around herself, the grief that shadowed her eyes, the absence of the wolf that marked her as incomplete. She endured, jaw tight, hands clenched, until the canyon's maw swallowed them whole, its towering walls closing like the ribs of some long-dead beast, runes carved into the rock glowing faintly with wards that pulsed as if alive. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with the weight of old magic that pressed against their skin, and the first trap revealed itself in the form of shifting stone, the ground crumbling beneath them into a chasm of lightless depth. Rorik leapt with the ease of a predator. Kaelin's power steadied the collapsing edge, and Rhys calculated the path in a breath. But Elara stumbled, her foot catching, the abyss yawning below. Rorik's harsh laugh bit into the air even as he reached for the ledge, spitting words that she was dead weight, a liability dragging them toward ruin, and for a heartbeat shame and despair clawed her chest. But then, in the desperation of that fall, something flickered inside her, a thread of silver light sparking from her palm to the stone, weaving a hold that steadied the collapse long enough for her to scramble back to safety. And when the glow faded, it left her trembling and wide-eyed, unsure of what she had just done. Rorik's mocking silence was louder than his laughter had been, for his gaze lingered on her with something new, something reluctant and uneasy, as though the lines he had drawn between strength and weakness no longer held steady. They pressed on, the canyon swallowing them deeper, traps and wards waiting with each turn. But beneath the hostility, a shift had begun, fragile as breath, and though Rorik's words remained shal, or p, there was a flicker in his eyes that betrayed a truth he would not yet speak, that perhaps the healer he despised was not as powerless as he had believed. The canyon's silence pressed heavier after that moment, as if the walls themselves had witnessed the flicker of light from Elara's hand and now held their breath in wonder. Yet no one spoke of it, not even Rorik, whose eyes lingered on her with a confusion he disguised as disdain. And so they walked on, deeper into the twisting ribs of stone, where shadows grew thicker and the wards carved centuries ago pulsed brighter, warning them that the heart of the trial lay near. Each step felt like trespass, the air humming with a low vibration that crawled against their skin, a reminder that the canyon was more than stone. It was alive with the remnants of old packs and unforgiven blood. Kaelin walked ahead, his posture rigid, every muscle drawn tight, as though the canyon itself tested his authority. And at times his aura flared with that unstable surge that shook the very ground, forcing the others to steady themselves in the wake of his unchained temper. And though he spoke little, his presence filled every silence. Rhys, calm as ever, marked the path with quiet eyes, his gaze tracing symbols and hidden cracks that might have been missed, his quiet warnings saving them from more than one carved illusion that tried to lead them astray. Yet Elara felt the weight most keenly, for though she trailed close, her every heartbeat carried the echo of that silver spark she had summoned, unbidden, untrained. And as she brushed her fingers against the canyon's glowing runes, she felt a faint answering hum that none of the others seemed to notice. It unnerved her, this sense of being watched not only by her companions, but by the stones themselves, as though her presence stirred something long forgotten. And when the second trial revealed itself, a corridor where fire burst sudden from cracks in the stone, flames racing with hungry speed, Rorik shoved past her with a snarl, mocking that her healer's hands would blister before they reached the end. Yet when his stride faltered at a sudden surge of flame, she acted without thought, her palm lifting, and once again silver threads unraveled in the air, bending the fire just enough for him to regain his footing. He said nothing after, his mouth set in a grim line, but his silence was no longer cruel. It carried the weight of reluctant recognition. The canyon's path wound on, demanding more from them with every turn, each ward older and stronger, each step a gamble with death. And though Elara stumbled more than once, each time she rose again, her fear tempered with the quiet determination that had carried her through loss and exile. Behind her, the whispers of the canyon grew louder, not in words, but in rhythm, a pulse that seemed to beat with her own, and though she did not yet understand, she felt it. She was not merely surviving this trial, she was awakening something the others could not see, something that shifted the very air around them, and though Kalen's gaze burned her when he looked her way, it was Rorik's haunted silence that told her the truth most plainly. The healer with no wolf was beginning to unravel the chains of her silence, and the canyon itself was listening. The canyon air grew heavier as the group pressed deeper into the labyrinth of stone and silence, their footsteps echoing with an eerie rhythm that mirrored the weight pressing down on each of their shoulders. And though Elara's chest still burned from the terror of nearly losing them in the last ward, she forced herself to walk beside Rorik, his scowl carving into her nerves like the edge of a blade. Yet beneath his contempt, there was something unsettled, something she did not yet understand, and the path narrowed into a jagged passage where the walls themselves seemed to close around them, like the throat of a beast, forcing them into single file, Kalen at the front, with his aura restless, shifting like a storm straining against fragile restraint. Rhys just behind him, with quiet eyes that missed nothing, Rorik's broad form next, his armor scratched from the canyon's cruel embrace, and Elara trailing, feeling both unseen and exposed all at once, the fragile link holding this uneasy company together. It was in this suffocating stillness that the trial revealed its cruelty, for they entered a chamber where the air thickened with ancient magic, a circle etched into the stone ground glowing faintly with red light, and the runes whispered in voices older than memory, declaring the law of the canyon itself. One must bleed so the others could pass, one must give willingly or all would perish, and the echo of the decree coiled around Elara's heart like cold iron, for she had heard stories of such tests, but stories never captured the sharpness of reality. Kalen's expression hardened into steel, though his eyes flickered toward Elara, as if daring fate to demand her life. Rhys clenched his jaw, stepping forward as though ready to take the burden, but the runes flared, rejecting his attempt, choosing instead with merciless clarity, their glow pulling toward Elara like a thread binding her to the choice. And she staggered, her breath breaking in panic as every gaze turned to her. Kalen's aura flaring in refusal, Rorik's eyes narrowing, unreadable, and Rhys whispering a curse under his breath, knowing what this meant. The canyon demanded her sacrifice, demanded the life of the wolfless healer, and though her legs trembled, Elara raised her chin, fighting the instinct to shrink, the instinct born of years of loss and silence, and she whispered that if fate required her blood, she would not let others suffer in her place. Yet before she could step into the circle, the shadows erupted with steel and claws. Lalitha's betrayal uncoiling in the form of hidden spies, their ambush cutting across the chamber with merciless precision, blades flashing, arrows hissing, and the trial of loyalty twisted into something darker, something human and cruel. Kalen roared, his power shaking the chamber as he threw back two attackers with a surge of raw force. Rhys moved with deadly grace, his dagger spilling light as he carved through shadow. Elara stumbled back, her healer's hands trembling but already reaching for wounds, for survival. Yet it was Rorik who faced the choice laid bare, for Boren's order echoed through his mind. Let the girl die, let her blood paint the stone, and with her gone, Boren's path to victory would be assured, and Elara, struggling to keep an arrow from piercing her chest, lifted wide eyes toward him, not pleading, not begging, but with the same quiet defiance that had once made her sit on the throne without meaning to, and in that heartbeat, something inside Rorik shifted like ice breaking under spring thaw. His blade met the enemy's with a clash that shook the chamber, not against Kaelin or Rhys, not in obedience to Boren, but against the assassins that sought Elara's life, and he snarled that if Boren wanted her dead, he would have to kill Rorik first, a declaration that burned hotter than steel, a betrayal of his alpha that severed years of loyalty in a single breath. Elara gasped as his arm caught her, pulling her behind him, his shield raised not for honor, not for glory, but for her survival. And as the battle raged around them, she felt something fragile and strange stir, the first thread of trust weaving through fear, though her heart still ached with doubt. And when the last spy fell, their blood staining the runes, silence swallowed the chamber once more, the trial unfulfilled, but watching, waiting. And Elara sank to her knees, her fingers brushing the blood-soaked stone, realizing she had not yet faced the test demanded of her. But perhaps the canyon had shifted its gaze, marking not just her sacrifice, but the sacrifice of loyalty torn from Rorik's chest. Elara's breath came in ragged bursts. As she pressed her palm against the cold, blood-slick runes, the heat of the battle still clinging to the air, the copper tang of spilled life mingling with the acrid smoke of broken wards. And, though her hands shook, she forced herself to look up, to meet the eyes of the men who surrounded her. Kaelin's storm-dark gaze filled with both fury and something raw, something that twisted her stomach into knots, Rhys wiping crimson from his blades with a calmness that could only be forged through years of ruthless necessity, and Rorik, broad-shouldered and silent, the weight of his decision pressing into the ground around him like a second gravity, his chest heaving as though he had been reborn and broken in the same moment. The chamber pulsed with restless magic, the runes flickering like fireflies caught between life and death, demanding a sacrifice still, but the blood already staining them spoke of choices made, of betrayal declared, of fate itself shifting in the canyon's throat. And Elara felt the weight of the journal against her ribs, hidden beneath her cloak, a reminder of truths she had not yet dared to face. Her fingers itched to pull it free, to search its cryptic lines for meaning, but she held still, aware that Kaelin's aura pressed down upon them like a storm cloud ready to split the earth, his temper so volatile she feared he might shatter the stone itself. Yet when he finally spoke, his voice was not rage but steel, cutting through the silence with merciless finality, naming Lilitha a serpent, declaring that her treachery would not go unanswered, his words carrying into the cracks of the chamber as though the canyon itself bore witness. Rhys nodded sharply, though his eyes flickered with worry, because beneath Kaelin's fury lay a tremor, a fracture widening, his control slipping like sand through clenched fists. And Elara wondered if the Alpha King could hold himself together long enough to carry them through this trial, or if his power would turn against them before their enemies did. Rorik shifted, his jaw tight, his gaze on the stone rather than and their faces, and Elara, watching him, realized the enormity of what he had done, severed his oath to Boran, the Alpha who had raised him, the man who had carved his life into obedience. And though his scorn still lingered in his voice, his choice had spoken louder than any insult, louder than any blade, and for the first time she saw not only the brute warrior, but the fractured soul beneath, torn between the chains of his past and the uncertain path ahead. That night, as they found a hollow in the canyon wall to rest, the silence was thicker than the shadows. Kaelin pacing like a wolf caged in his own fury, Rhys keeping watch with his eyes scanning the darkness for more assassins, and Rorik sitting apart, his massive frame hunched, his hands still stained with the blood of those who had sought Elara's life, and Elara herself curling against the stone, her body weary, yet her mind refusing rest. At last, when the others' breathing softened into uneasy rhythms, she dared to take out her grandmother's journal. The leather cracked, the ink faded, and as her fingers traced the lines of a passage she had not yet deciphered, the letters seemed to shift under her gaze, as though the canyon's magic had unlocked something within them. The words rose from the page like whispers carried on the wind. The soul weaver does not heal others until she heals herself, and the breath caught in her throat, for the truth of it pierced her deeper than any blade, deeper than the loss that had hollowed her chest, because she had been trying to mend everyone else. Kaelin's volatility, Rorik's scorn, even Rhys's careful restraint, without facing the cavern of grief inside her, the silence where her wolf's voice should have been. Her hands trembled as tears blurred the ink, and she pressed the journal to her chest, realizing with a jolt of terror that the trial was not just of the body, not just of loyalty or blood, but of the spirit. And if she could not confront her own brokenness, she would fail them all. She thought of her pack, of the laughter that once filled the clearing, of the night their flames were extinguished, of her mother's hand slipping from hers, of the silence that swallowed her wolf in that instant, and she wept in silence, muffling her sobs against the stone, afraid the others would hear, yet needing to let the grief flow before it consumed her entirely. Somewhere in the darkness, Rorik stirred, his gaze flicking toward her, unreadable, but he did not speak, only turned back toward the fireless dark, and Elara wondered if he, too, had seen her strength flicker when instinct had saved him, if he now saw her as something more than the fragile healer he had mocked. When dawn crept into the canyon with its pale light, Kaelin's command cut through the air like steel once more, but Elara carried with her the weight of that journal's truth, the dawning realization that her power would remain a shadow until she could face her pain head-on. And though her shoulders trembled, though her heart still bled, she knew the time for silence was ending, that the canyon would demand more than loyalty and blood. It would demand her soul, and she would either rise to give it or break beneath its weight. The canyon's silence deepened as though it had been waiting for her all along, a hush that pressed against Elara's skin until she could hardly breathe, and as the others moved carefully across the uneven stone, she felt herself pulled toward a narrow fissure glowing faintly with silver light, a light no one else seemed to notice, a light that called only to her, and before she could resist, her feet carried her inside, the air shifting from heat to cold, the walls closing in like the bones of a forgotten beast. Her breath hitched as the fissure widened into a cavern, its walls carved with runes that pulsed like the beat of a living heart, and the silver glow intensified until it swallowed her, dragging her into a vision so sharp she cried out, or she stood not in the canyon, but in the ashes of her old home, the night her pack had been slaughtered. Flames roared around her, devouring the trees, the cries of her kin pierced the night, and the scent of burning fur and blood tore into her lungs as if it had never left, and she was that broken girl again, clutching her mother's hand only to feel it slip away, her legs frozen while shadows tore her world apart. She staggered, clutching her chest, whispering that she could not watch it again, but the vision held her captive, forcing her to relive every scream, every torn body, every heartbeat that stopped around her, and then, cutting through the chaos, came a voice she had longed for and feared all at once, the voice of her wolf. It was not gentle, but sharp as shattered glass, a growl beneath the words, accusing her with ruthless clarity. "You abandoned me. You abandoned yourself." Elara fell to her knees, sobs racking her body, because the truth of it was undeniable. She had buried her wolf's voice with her grief, silenced it beneath guilt and fear, convincing herself that surviving meant pretending she was nothing, no one, invisible. The voice snarled again, furious and raw, demanding to know why she had let herself wither, why she had caged the very spirit that was meant to walk beside her, and Elara pressed her hands to the earth, choking out that she had been afraid, that she had lost everyone, that she thought by silencing her wolf she could bury the pain. The silence that followed was unbearable until the wolf whispered, low and guttural, "And did it ease your pain, or did it hollow you into nothing?" Elara's tears burned, but for the first time she did not hide from them. She let them fall. She let the anguish surge through her. She let herself feel the full weight of the night that had broken her, and instead of drowning, she clung to it, to the truth that paid, and was not her weakness, but her proof of survival. "I will not run from you again," she whispered into the vision, her voice shaking but certain. I will not silence myself, not anymore. The flames around her shifted, dimming, and from within the smoke emerged a form of silver light, a wolf, fierce and luminous, its eyes the same shade as her own, its body woven of moonfire and spirit. It stepped closer, nuzzling against her chest, and warmth flooded her veins like liquid sunlight, a union rekindled, a bond reforged. And when her wolf spoke again, it was no longer accusation, but fierce loyalty. We are one. Together, we rise. The cavern dissolved, and Elara gasped as she returned to the canyon, her body alight with new strength, her veins thrumming with soul weaver power. And the silver glow did not fade but blazed from her skin like a second dawn. She stumbled back into the group to find chaos. Kalen struck down, blood pouring from his side where a poisoned blade had pierced him, Reese shouting, Rorik battling with feral desperation, and for a moment, fear clawed her. But then her wolf rose within her, steady and unyielding, and she dropped to Kalen's side, pressing her hands to his wound. Silver light poured from her fingertips, weaving into his torn flesh, knitting bone and sinew, burning the poison into ash, and the air itself seemed to still as the courtly warriors around them watched in stunned silence. Kalen's eyes flew open, the storm within them colliding with awe as he felt her power surge through him, healing not just his body, but something fractured in his spirit, and the canyon echoed with gasps, whispers trembling on every tongue, Soul Weaver, the legend reborn. Elara lifted her hands, her chest heaving, the silver glow fading into a steady pulse beneath her skin, and though she felt raw, stripped open, she knew she had crossed a threshold she could never return from. Across the canyon, Boran's face darkened, his fury barely masked as his eyes burned into her, and his voice cut like a promise of death as he declared that she was not a Hiei. Lear, not a savior, but a weapon Kalen had hidden, a weapon that would destroy them all, and he swore before the canyon itself that he would see her ended, his vow hanging like a blade above her fragile yet unyielding heart. Boran's vow still rang like iron in the canyon air when the path widened into the heart of the trial, a vast hollow where jagged cliffs formed a circle around a floor etched with runes older than memory, glowing faintly with the pulse of ancient power, and it was here that the final confrontation began, for Boran strode forward, his presence a wall of brute force and fury, his voice booming as he demanded Kalen's submission, declaring the throne unfit for a king who clung to weakness, who leaned on healers and half-forgotten myths instead of raw strength. The words struck the air like spears, and Kalen stepped forward, his aura flaring in violent bursts, lightning and shadow tangled in his energy. But it was clear to every eye that he struggled to hold steady, his chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm, his temper fraying, his power threatening to break free and consume even those he meant to protect. Reese tensed at his side, ready to intervene, but Boran's challenge left no space for retreat, and the court held its breath as the two alphas faced each other, one driven by tradition sharpened into tyranny, the other by progress fractured by his own instability. Then, before Kalen could break, before Boran's dominance could crash over them all, Elara stepped forward, her voice quiet, yet carrying across the canyon with the weight of something stronger than power. Conviction. Silver light shimmered faintly from her skin, her wolf steady at her side in spirit, and as Boran's sneer twisted with contempt, she did not raise her hands to strike, but to weave, her magic spilling into the air, not as a weapon, but as a thread, binding them all, touching all, ease and enemies alike. The glow seeped into wounds still raw from the last fight, into bruises and gashes, closing them with gentle fire, and the court gasped as even Boran's men felt their pain. Soothed, their fear calmed against their will, the air itself shifting beneath her will. Her voice rose with the magic, not pleading, but steady, exposing Boran not with insults or threats, but with truth, laying bare the hollow core of his fury, the way his reign of fear was nothing but a cage for wolves too afraid to face change. Rorik, standing tall beside her, threw down his last shred of loyalty to Borin, declaring before all that he would no longer follow chains disguised as honor, his betrayal striking deeper than any blade, and Rhys, sharp and calculating, guided the flow of warriors into place, cutting off Borin's support until the Alpha of the North stood alone in his rage. Borin lunged with brute force, his claws dripping with power, but Kalen faltered under the weight of his own breaking aura, stumbling to his knees, and for one heart-stopping instant it seemed the kingdom would collapse with him. Yet Elara moved between them, her light flaring brighter, her wolf's roar echoing within her chest as she caught Borin's strike, not with steel, but with soul-weaver fire, weaving his violence into nothing, unraveling it until his strength turned to dust in his own hands. The canyon shook with the force of it, but when the dust cleared, it was not Kalen's unstable might that stood victorious, nor Borin's brute tyranny, but Elara's unyielding resilience, her power forged in grief and tempered by compassion, stronger than claw or fang, because it was born of survival and love. Borin fell, defeated, his body pinned not by chains, but by the silence of a court that no longer believed in him, his roar swallowed by the whispers spreading like wildfire. Soul Weaver, the legend reborn. And when the court finally returned from the canyon, carrying stories on their lips and awe in their eyes, the whispers deepened into conviction. The age of endless war was ending. The age of soul weavers had returned, and the fragile healer no one had noticed was now the name spoken with reverence. Elara walked beside Kalen as they emerged from the canyon, no longer hidden in the shadows, no longer unseen or broken, but whole, luminous, the woman who had steadied a king and healed a kingdom, her presence not as ornament or servant, but as equal, her story no longer one of loss, but of a roar that rose from ashes and changed the world forever.